I am almost certain that Dan Feng was framed, not just for the creation of Bailu, but also for almost all of the crimes of the sedition. I think both he and Xing will turn out to be innocent victims of the schemes of the preceptors. As a heads up, this video is a continuation of my previous video about the Bloomborn Scion, and I will be assuming that you've watched that video already. Please do if you haven't, because there's a lot of important foundational information that I'll be building from in this video. This time, I want to talk about Shuhu, the events of the Sedition, the Half-Draconic Abomination, and Jingliu. I also want to discuss the character designs of Bai Heng, Bai Lu, and Dan Feng, as well as a wild theory about Ruan Mei's potential involvement in this story too. Be aware that this video will include a lot of my personal speculation due to the limited and questionable nature of the sources that we have available to us right now. So there's a good chance a portion of this video will become invalid as we learn more. With that in mind, I think the best place to start is discussing the figure most central to the narrative, the emanator of Yaoshi, Shuhu. He's quite an enigmatic character at this point in the narrative, with most of his information hidden away in different locations. The first time we hear anything substantial about Shuhu is in a document called The Thousand-Hand Merciful Medicus Salvation. This is a document from the disciples of Sanctus Medicus where they more or less claim that Shuhu is their leader or teacher. We don't know how much of this is true and how much is fanciful fiction, but given that Shuhu does have a long history with the Xianzhou, there is likely some truth to this document. It contains a lot of Buddhist references. Even Yaoshi is named after an existing Buddhist historical figure, the Medicine King, but I won't be discussing Buddhist philosophy much today. It is likely that this document is inspired by the in-game text Divine Scripture of the Secrets and Miracles of Shuhu's Manifestations. This scripture tells the story of a foxy and helm master of the Yao Qing named Yuyan, who became the first master primus of the disciples of Sanctus Medicus. In the year 5320, he witnessed the Antimatter Legion destroy Moldrasil, the home of the Wingweavers, while the Alliance simply observed. The overwhelming death and destruction shook Yuyan's belief to the core. In the end, he left the Xianzhou and roamed the stars in search of answers, eventually finding Shuhu on the dead planet Rahu and witnessed him bring the planet back to life, which caused it to throb like an embryo in the mother's womb. He then followed Shuhu and recorded his miracles and teachings, the same ones that the disciples of Sanctus Medicus follow to this day. 1,000 years before the events of the sedition, when Jingliu was just a girl, she encountered the living planet Rahu when it devoured her home, the Xianzhou ship Shangsheng. Miraculously, she was one of the only survivors of this attack. She was deeply traumatized by it, and it motivated her to do whatever she could to eventually defeat Rahu and, by extension, Shuhu. This attack on Shangsheng was also the same attack that doomed the twin sisters Xueyi and Hanya. We know from their stories that Shuhu was there himself. According to Hanya's point of view, she saw a colossal walking tree monster with many faces, one of which was her sister's. Using Xueyi's face, the monster encouraged Hanya to embrace immortal life and become part of the tree. She almost succumbed but was rescued by General Tang Xiao just in time. Then we see the same scene from Xueyi's point of view, revealing just how potent Shuhu's illusions are. Shuhu showed Xueyi a fake illusion of her sister's death. In this version of the story, Shuhu is the tree with 1,000 faces, and he promised to save all of them. Xueyi sobbed and was unable to resist him. She was just one face on his tree. Then General Tang Xiao arrived. As you can see, although some things remain the same, such as the arrival of Tang Xiao and the colossal tree with many faces, the actual experiences of Xueyi and Hanya were very different. Hanya was never dead, but that was the illusion that Shuhu showed Xueyi. And Xueyi never spoke to Hanya, but that's what Hanya saw instead. Keep this mastery of illusions in mind as we break down the story because it plays a big role later on. Thanks to Jingyuan's Story 4, we also know that during the prime of the High Cloud Quintet, they defeated another living planet called the Ketu Mirage. Rahu and Ketu are references to Hindu mythology. According to the myth, they were originally one person, an Azure, who disguised themselves and tricked the god Vishnu into giving them the elixir of immortality. The sun and moon deities revealed their trick to Vishnu, who immediately severed them in half, creating Rahu and Ketu. Though they are depicted as solar and lunar eclipses, they are considered to be shadow planetary bodies, which is likely why they appear as living planets in Honkai Star Rail. Because of the connection between Rahu and Ketu, we know that Shuhu was likely involved in this attack by the Ketu Mirage on the Xueyi also. Note that the name of the Ketu Mirage also implies more illusory magic was used here too. One thing that is important to mention now is that the disciples of Sanctus Medicus are a very old organization. It originally existed as a group that worshipped Yaoshe in secrecy, but eventually was transformed into the Cold Spring sect, where they denounced Yaoshe as the martial band to the disciples of Sanctus Medicus. It should be noted that the Cold Spring sect and the Alchemy Commission were closely connected. It's believed by the officials that the disciples of Sanctus Medicus were no longer functional, as proven in their official announcement on the origins of the disciples of Sanctus Medicus. The Ten Lords Commission believes that the modern version of the Disciples of Sanctus Medicus was created by Dan Shu less than 30 years ago, but we, the audience, know that the organization has been functional for much longer than that, as demonstrated by Yunhua's experiments that preceded Dan Shu's. Bai Lu describes what was happening pretty well.
Just because you can't see something doesn't mean it isn't there. It's like eradicating a sickness. Easier to do when the symptoms are visible. In hindsight, not only did the disciples endure, they expanded the organization in secret.
Some claim that the original disciples of Sanctus Medicus viewed Mara as a flaw in following Yasha's will, but since we know they were founded on Shuhu's ideologies and that Shuhu incited Mara prematurely with his creations, logically it doesn't make sense that they would genuinely denounce Mara. In my opinion, just because the Cold Spring sect claimed no association with Dan Shu's iteration of the Disciples of Sanctus Medicus, since they're all associated with the Alchemy Commission, I believe this is simply a front. One more thing I want to talk about is the inspiration for Shuhu's name. The regular meaning of his name means suddenly or within a blink of an eye. Interestingly, Passerby of Wandering Clouds uses this meaning in the headpiece during the line, "When the face in the reflection was no longer a stranger's, the unnamed suddenly realized the dead branch was sprouting flower buds." This is a pun that indicates to the audience that the sprouting of flower buds is a result of Shuhu's power. Just as Shuhu says in Xueyi's story, "I can save her, I can save all of you. All it takes is a wave of the branch, and I can teach flesh to regrow from the mere bones, or let petals rise up out of the dust to the flower once more. You know very well I can." In case this use of Shuhu as suddenly in the relic sect sounds like it might be a coincidence, consider that the word is used only a total of 27 times in the text map, including every time Shuhu is mentioned directly by name. His name is also inspired by the Tianwan poem in the Chuzi collection, which asks the heavens questions, one of which is, "Where is Shuhu?" It is paired with the question of, "Where is the nine-headed dragon?" This implies a connection between these two topics. This poem also mentions the torch dragon, which is directly referenced by Dan Shu when you talk to her outside of a quest. She calls it the candle dragon in English, but the Chinese uses Zhulong, which is the torch dragon. This is the only mention of the torch dragon in the game, further emphasizing the connection between Shuhu and the disciples of Sanctus Medicus. Interestingly, the torch dragon is always described as red, and its eyes are the sun that illuminates the darkness. This reminds me of Dan Feng's light cone, where he is trapped in a lightless dungeon, and his gaze is described as shining brighter than the sun. Candle Dragon reminds me of the image of Blade's eyes overlapped with candles, and that one flickering candle he cannot snuff out. Now onto the juiciest part of the video, the Sedition of Imbibitor Lunae. To set the scene, it's important to highlight that the relationship between the Imbibitor Lunae and most of the preceptors was tenuous to begin with, likely because of the feud started by Yubia when he moved the Dragon Palace and the ocean waters to seal the arbor. Though at least 100 preceptors aided Yubia in his goal, there was a lot of public backlash. We can see this highlighted especially in the Mirage Echoes. As the Imbibitor Lunae, Dan Feng's primary duty was to maintain the seal over the arbor containing the maddened and frenzied dragon. It's important to note that Yubia's seal over the arbor was necessary because, for some reason, the tree was invoking Mara in the lawful citizens. Yubia's seal saved the citizens from this attack. Logically, we can conclude that it was the sealed, maddened, and frenzied dragon that was the source of the Mara, just like Rahu and the Half-Draconic Abomination were in Jingliu's character stories. It's important to note that multiple sources are stating that the arbor itself was somehow damaged in the Sedition of Imbibitor Lunae, with Yu Yuan specifically saying that it was shaken to its core, or uprooted in other languages. And the Ikra of Two Dragons video description tells us that he threatened the sacred wood. We also know that the seals were compromised, and the preceptors were requesting Dan Feng to be freed to fix the seals. Keep in mind what I said earlier about Shuhu and the disciples of Sanctus Medicus, as well as the collaboration between the Vidyadhara and Sanctus Medicus to achieve their goals as outlined in the previous video. This information is important because in patch 1.2, when Dan Heng approaches the Scale Gorge waterscape for the first time, he encounters a mirage echo that tells him that he shouldn't go because his enemies are waiting for him. Dan Heng refuses them, and the mirage echo tells us that he didn't heed them back then either. This tells us that when Dan Feng approached the Scale Gorge waterscape originally, he was also advised by his allies that his enemies were waiting there for him. Do you remember the horned Vidyadhara preceptor named Taoran? Well, here he is in the corner of this picture, standing just ahead of the still elderly Xing. We assume this is Taoran because of the white hair that are the same as the image of Taoran in the Myriad trailer. It should also be noted that the orb in the sky here is very likely Dan Feng's dragon transformation animation, as it looks the same as the orb when Dan Heng is stabbed and subsequently transmutes into his Dan Heng Imbibitor Lunae form. The figure inside the orb looks like Dan Feng to me. It even mirrors the falling form of Dan Heng in the water, but some people insist this is Bai Heng, as shown. I want to point out that Bai Heng doesn't line up as well as Dan Feng because she wears a skirt and cape, not baggy pants. Not to mention that at this point in the story, Bai Heng's remains have already been obliterated by the Black Sun, so there should not be a body to transmute here. This is where things get a bit confusing. Dan Feng attempted to turn into a dragon or undergo some transmutation on himself. His conversation with Xing revealed that he desired to put an end to the invasions of the denizens of abundance, which would continue to happen so long as the arbor was intact. Later, during Jingliu's story 4, he said that the preceptors told him that his actions should have resulted in the creation of a new High Elder, and that all of this shouldn't be like this. As far as we know, there were no preceptors in the scene with Jingliu, but we do know that some of the preceptors teamed up with the Cloud Knights to arrest Dan Feng. To me, this situation sounds exactly like a setup, the very setup that the water mirage loyal to Dan Feng was referring to earlier. This is made extra suspicious by the existence of the Scale Gorge Vidyadhara egg belonging to a preceptor of Glaciator Marum, who believed Dan Feng's preceptors instructed the sedition. They wished to punish those preceptors, but Glaciator Marum denied them and sent them to the Luofu alone, where they inevitably became this egg. All of this leads to the question of why would Dan Feng even agree to the creation of a new High Elder in the first place? Well, this leads back to the battle with Shuhu and the death of Bai Heng, but not in the way that you're expecting. When Dan Feng transformed into a dragon, he was fighting Shuhu to the point of being on the verge of death. Then Bai Heng shot through everything like an arrow shaft. Keep in mind, during the scene, Dan Heng observed everything from a third-personal point of view, as indicated by the out-of-body experience line and the statement that he was observing himself. This everything that Bai Heng shot through would have included part of Dan Feng's dragon that was entangled with Shuhu at the time of her arrival. I believe during this scene Dan Feng's Azure dragon was injured or even killed, which explains why later on, during the scene with the Half-Draconic Abomination, Dan Feng is not fighting the dragon himself, despite possessing Cloud Piercer that was specifically pointed out to be able to pierce dragon scales. Instead, Jingliu, who was so injured from her fight with Xing that she was barely able to hold herself together, was the one to fight the abomination. On a raw power level, Dan Feng is much more powerful than Jingliu when also accounting for his godlike High Elder abilities, so this arrangement makes no sense, unless Dan Feng is physically incapable of fighting the abomination for some reason. I would also like to mention that Dan Feng specifies that he used the soul of his ancestor and the blood of his race in the ritual that created the Half-Draconic Abomination. The soul of his ancestor could only be the soul of a dragon, as Vidyadhara reincarnate and don't have parents. In my opinion, this is probably the soul of his Azure dragon, though it is also possible that he may have been trying to invoke Long themselves to create a new dragon life. I'm more inclined towards the Azure dragon theory in this instance, though, given the rest of the context. The blood of his race is obvious. This is the blood of the Vidyadhara. Keep in mind that the Vidyadhara share a lot of similarities with the Oceanids of Genshin, so they are probably also made of water, just like the fish that fly around the waterscape and these mysterious caged birds around the Luofu. In Dan Heng Imbibitor Lunae's idol animation, it starts to rain. He hears a dragon rumble and says,
"Old friends, meet yet again."
To me, this implies the water of the rain is the old friends. This leads me to the part of Dan Heng Imbibitor Lunae Story 3, where Dan Heng is burying the remnants of his old friend's hallowed blood and creating a new life that had not been seen for millennia. In the context that I've explained, it's fairly easy to see how the creation of a new High Elder coincides with the burial of his Azure dragon. There are many people that firmly believe this is talking about Bai Heng's blood, but I have a lot to say about this. Firstly, Bai Heng only left a few drops of blood amidst a bloody sanguine battlefield, so their extracting of her blood in the first place is extremely unbelievable. English says that she also left a tuft of hair, but this is an incorrect translation. She left a singular broken strand of hair, so they wouldn't have been using her hair either. English says the blood was hallowed, but this is not quite accurate to the Chinese. It's supposed to be the blood of a martyr, which admittedly sounds exactly like Bai Heng at first, but then you look at the origins of this phrase and things become a lot more interesting. The phrase used is bishui, which literally translates to bluish-green blood. This means the blood of a martyr because it comes from the story of a man called Chang Hong. He was a very loyal minister, but was ultimately condemned and exiled for a crime he did not commit. He dies soon after, and his blood is collected and stored for 3 years, where it then turns blue. From that point, the Chinese phrase blue blood refers to the blood of someone loyal and true that dies for a just cause. Where this gets extra interesting is that it also states his heart was red, Dan Xin, creating the phrase of bishui Dan Xin, or blue blood, red heart. For similar reasons as blue blood, the red heart phrase also means someone loyal. So this combines into a singular phrase emphasizing the virtuous characteristics of an individual. The astute might notice that the Dan in Dan Xin is the same as in Dan Heng and Dan Feng. Though this may sound like a coincidence, it's confirmed to be intentional. There was a recent Famitsu interview in Japanese that confirmed the inspiration for Dan Heng's name to be an abbreviation of the phrase Tanshin wa tsune no gotoku. This means something like loyalty like eternity. Japanese and Chinese share a lot of characters, and in this instance you can see that Tanshin is written the same as Danshin, and has the translated meaning of a loyal heart. So what I'm saying is that the use of bishui in this passage is a clever allusion to Dan Heng's name, and if somehow all of that isn't enough to convince you, please consider that he is literally made of blue water. He has literal blue blood, was named after a phrase that means eternal loyalty, and was exiled and died for a crime he didn't commit. I don't know how else they could have possibly made this reference more obvious. Now, you might be wondering, if Dan Heng was just trying to create a new High Elder because his own Azure dragon was injured or killed, how did that result in the Half-Draconic Abomination? There are 2 possible answers to this. The seal on the arbor was confirmed to be loosened during the sedition, so the corruption of the mad and frenzied dragon inside somehow made up the abomination portion of the Half-Draconic Abomination. The other possible answer is that Shuhu made up the abomination portion. Keep in mind what I said about the disciples of Sanctus Medicus being loyal to Shuhu, and that some of the preceptors are confirmed to be working with the disciples of Sanctus Medicus. I suspect that Shuhu was brought to the Scale Gorge waterscape. After all, Blade has to have gotten Shuhu's gift from somewhere, but it wasn't by Xing, like Jingliu suspected, but by Shuhu's loyalists, the disciples of Sanctus Medicus, the organization founded on his principles and teachings. Jingliu only arrived at the scene well after the deed was already done, so she didn't see anything herself. Jingliu didn't suspect the preceptors because they were the same people who informed the Cloud Knights of what was happening and sent her and her people to stop Dan Feng. This also explains why Dan Feng remains silent after his arrest. He knows there's nothing he can say. There's no one left that he could trust to believe him over the preceptor's lies. I also want to talk a little bit about the Half-Draconic Abomination too. It's inspired by the Black Dragon in one of the legends of the goddess Nuwa, the creator of humans. To quickly summarize this story, the pillars of heaven collapsed, causing devastating floods and fires, and a black dragon was rampaging around who was usually the culprit. Nuwa slays the black dragon and repairs the pillars of heaven. The description of the Half-Draconic Abomination's rampage says it sundered floating isles, which is presumably why there's so many broken pillars surrounding the Scale Gorge waterscape. It should be noted that the Black Dragon and the Half-Draconic Abomination are again referenced when interacting with the dragon-shaped tree in the Alchemy Commission, with the line, "The sturdy and thick trunk of the ancient tree rises upwards like a black dragon. When you look up at the tree, you hear a faint sound of wind and lightning." This is suspicious because this appears to be the same, or at least a very similar tree to the one featured in Dan Heng's Ultimate, and of course the namesake of Dan Feng, which translates to red maple. There's also the suspicious fact that the Alchemy Commission is covered in red trees that are confirmed to be entirely fake and made out of metal, which seems to me like it might be an attempt to make this dragon-shaped tree less conspicuous. It also sort of looks like it might be crying, which makes this ingredient called root of dragon tears very suspicious. This is probably unrelated, but I also want to point out that Blade calls himself the Smiling Black Dragon at one point. I'll leave links to better sources explaining this, but there's a contestant that joins the fighting ring in Belobog, calling himself the Smiling Black Dragon, formatted the same as Cold Dragon Young in Chinese. It's accompanied by some strange things appearing in the Belobog daily mission, A Marvelous Night at Boulder Town. It includes red paint on the wall and a piece of paper that reads, "You will never get away from me." There are also some barely legible dirt marks on the wall that seem to trace out the number 3, a reference to a 5-3 must pay the price. Okay, now it's time to talk about Jingliu. She states in her character story that the crime Dan Feng and Yingxing committed was the resurrection of Dan Feng's companion. The wording is strange, but the context of the quest implies that it's by Hung, though honestly it could fit the description of the dragon too. The thing is, I believe that Jingliu believes the story about them attempting to resurrect Bai Hung, and I believe that she believes Bai Lu is the result of the resurrection. I also believe that Jingliu is wrong, and another victim of the manipulation of Shuhu, the Preceptors, and the Alchemy Commission. Do you remember what I said earlier about Xueyi and Hanya falling victim to different illusions created by Shuhu? Jingliu's story 4 tells us in plain words that she was also in an illusion. It says, "In an illusion that feels half like a dream and half like reality, she feels her flesh has finally transcended its limits and has started to disintegrate. There are restraints binding her like strings, tightly wrapped around her limbs and organs, slicing apart her final shreds of self-consciousness bit by bit. Suddenly, she hears the words, 'I will cut down even the stars in the sky.'" This phrase is a reference to her promise to Bai Hung, as shown in her previous character story, presumably about finally defeating Shuhu and Rahu. We also know that she thinks the abomination was created with Shuhu's powers because it elicited the same core-boiling traumatic response as Rahu did in her first story. We also see the outcome of this fight thanks to the point of view of a soldier in the area who was frozen by her attack. We learn that at the last moment her blindfold fell off, and she apologized both to the abomination and to the frozen soldier. From Jingliu's point of view, I think what happened is that the Cloud Knights received intel from the Preceptors that Dan Feng was up to no good and they had to stop him. She took the Cloud Knights to the Scale Gorge Waterscape where she found Yingxing, now a youthful immortal, and Dan Feng, who created a half-draconic abomination that's wreaking havoc. She fought Yingxing, but he was juiced up on what was likely something similar to the draft of Draconic Surge. She beat him, but was severely wounded. She then turned to Dan Feng and interrogated him about the Draconic Abomination. She felt her core S boiling and realized that Shuhu was there. As a veteran against Shuhu by this point, she was aware that his powers are illusory in nature. She made for herself a blindfold, thinking it would help her, and then fought the abomination. Instead of visual illusions, she began to feel them, and even heard an auditory illusion about her promise to Bai Hung. Remember, based on Hanya and Xueyi, Shuhu seems to make illusions related to our loved ones. At the end of the fight, her blindfold fell off and she apologized. There is some evidence that Jing Yuan arrived to stop her from killing Dan Feng and Yingxing at this point, but we don't know for sure, so I'll focus on that another time. Regardless, she lasted about a year after Dan Feng's arrest before succumbing to Mara, breaking out of the Ten Lords' containment, fighting Jing Yuan, and then disappearing for 800 years and having her name erased from the Luofu. This also brings up the question of why Jing Yuan let her go after their fight where he should have won, but again, that might be a topic for another video. I could rant about Jingliu for ages, but for brevity's sake, I'm just going to include one more point and then move on. There is a mirage where Jingliu has broken into someone that is supposedly exclusive to the Vidyadhar High Elder. This interaction is odd for a few reasons. Firstly, she isn't recognized. As the sword champion of the Luofu and high-ranking member of the Cloud Knights, her identity should be well known by everyone. This implies a long time skip to when her memory is mostly erased and nobody recognizes her anymore. Secondly, she finds an old man in the location where only the High Elder should be able to enter, implying she has discovered a preceptor or someone else lurking in this area that shouldn't be. We don't know how many times Jingliu visited the Luofu after her exile, which this scene must be since she was exiled before Dan Feng's death, but I assume this scene is before the creation of Bai Lu and she was expecting to find a resurrected Bai Heng, which she did not. Also, since Penacony is out now by the time I'm publishing this video, without spoiling much, doesn't anyone find it super suspicious how the plot has a nothing is as it seems smoke and mirrors vibe with direct references to red herrings made multiple times? Hoyo can, will, and has already happily misled the audience with vague statements and unreliable narrators in other plotlines. Just because Jingliu takes herself seriously does not mean she knows what happened. What we got in these patches was merely an introduction to the story of the Xianzhou. Alright, I've covered as much as I wanted to talk about in terms of interpreting the story of this edition for this video. Now I want to focus on some of the design aspects of the characters. The theory that Bai Lu was Bai Heng existed as soon as we first found out Bai Heng was the Foxian pilot, by putting together the views of the universe from a Starskiff readable with the Nameless Follower mission and the picture of the 5 members of the High Cloud Quintet. At this point, the theory existed solely off of vibes, and that was enough for it to persist, so I think it's important to break down their names and design. The first thing to address is their names. Yes, Bai Lu and Bai Heng share the same word Bai in their Chinese names. This word is extremely common and just means white. Actually, 4 separate characters on the Xianzhou have the word Bai in their names, so it's not even something only they share. These characters are Bai Heng, Bai Lu, Cauldron Master Baizi, and a Songxiang citizen named Bai Xiao. Bai Lu's name was first used in Genshin Impact. Fontaine, French for fountain, in Chinese is Fengdan, which, yes, uses the same characters as Dan Feng. The city is located in the Below region, which means beautiful waters in French and is called, you guessed it, Bai Lu in Chinese. Yes, it's the same characters as Bai Lu's name. The literal translation of the Chinese character in Bai Lu's name is White Dew, by the way, just as Dan Feng's is Red Maple, but both make references to water through clever French translations. These areas are likely designed side by side, so the references to each other are to be expected, honestly. In terms of why Bai Lu is purple, I legitimately think that it's just because Dan Heng already used both blue and green, and there are only so many cool-toned colors to choose from. Bai Heng's name, other than the alleged drama with an employee at Hoyoverse, is a reference to this white jade artifact. There's not much to say about it, honestly, but it is covered in clouds. I believe Bai Heng is an allegory of Lan the Hunt and all the Cloud Knights who have sacrificed their lives heroically in the wars against the Abundance. Even Jingliu's quest is called Clouds Leave No Trace, which at first you might think it's the High Cloud Quintet, which it could be, but don't forget Bai Heng's death was vanishing except for a few drops of blood and a broken strand of hair. Additional reasons I think she represents Lan include the fact that she also uses a bow and arrow, shares the purple color palette with the Aeon, and literally had psychic visions about his war when encountering a Heliobai. Psychic visions are presumed to be the reason that the hero hated the Arbor and Yaoshe before anyone else. She used what is likely a Stellaron or Heliobai in her final self-sacrificial attack, just like the hero did, and then proceeded to shoot through everything like an arrow before disappearing, which is literally the ending of the hero in the poems. Some people think Bai Lu and Bai Heng have the exact same hairstyle, but they don't. It's very similar, but the parts in the fringe are different and Bai Lu has 2 braids, whereas Bai Heng only has 1 braid. The little bit of fur on their shoulders is something shared by many characters. Their eyes are similar too, but again not exactly the same. As you can see, their pupils are different. They do look very similar, but honestly I think this is just part of Hoyo's plan to make people believe Bai Lu is Bai Heng, just like Jingliu does. Also, Hoyo has always had characters that look very similar that people theorize are somehow connected, but don't turn out to be for whatever reason. There are many, many examples as shown on screen. Sino and Razor are my favorite example, as not only are their appearances very similar, but they also use the same type of vision, roleplay as dogs, and summon a giant purple wolf spirit as their ultimate ability. They're also introduced in the same location, with Sino first introduced in Mondstadt in the comic, and yet these 2 characters are entirely unrelated. One other funny thing I want to mention is that Dan Feng and Dan Shu have nearly identical names in Chinese. Look at them, different by merely 2 strokes. There's a joke in here about someone making a typo when trying to write Dan Shu made Bai Lu, but wrote Dan Feng instead. One fun fact I want to bring up before moving on is that Dan Heng and Bai Lu might also be referenced to Arthurian Legends. We have Gwenaifen and her brother, who are references to characters in Arthurian legend, as well as Merlin's Claw being the title of one of the Xianzhou Arbiter generals. In Arthurian Legends, there exists a fight between a red dragon and a white dragon, which represents factions in a war. The white dragon looks like it's going to win, but the red dragon ends up winning in the end. Dan means red, and Bai means white. I don't know what it means for the plot or if it's in fact anything more than a fun reference, but Fontaine also has a lot of Arthurian references with the Melusine, the Holy Grail, etc. So it's surely intentional. Something kind of fun here too is that Dan also means cinnabar, which is a main ingredient in creating the Philosopher's Stone, which, for those that don't know, is supposed to be able to transmute things. And suddenly the fuss about the transmutation arcanum is making more sense, huh? Speaking of Philosopher's Stones, I think it's finally time to discuss the wild theory about Ruan Mei's potential involvement in the creation of Bailu. Special credits to Mari for being the first one to suggest this wild idea while we were analyzing the Ruan Mei drip teasing. I know that initially this concept sounds insane, and honestly it might be, but hear me out here. We know already that Bailu is a pretty young creation, especially if Dan Shu played a role in creating her, which is supported additionally by her being young enough that her slow growth isn't a huge concern, and that she hasn't come of age to be titled the Imbibitor Lunae. We don't know exactly how old Ruan Mei is right now, but she is certainly over at least 100 years old. She grew up on an icy planet with abundance and visits the Xianzhou occasionally. Her last living relative, her grandmother, joined the IPC Intelligentsia Guild and continued to watch her from afar. Ruan Mei is a ridiculously competent biologist with the goal of recreating or even becoming an Aeon. She has successfully recreated an emanator of propagation, though it could only survive for less than a minute before dying. Among her goals listed in her trailer, she specifically mentions that she wanted to recreate permanence.
You can dissect remembrance, control equilibrium, deconstruct beauty, and reproduce permanence.
Permanence here means the dragon Aeon long. I think there is a high chance she is actively involved with the disciples of Sanctus Medicus. Firstly, the Mei in her name means plum blossom, which is why she wears them on her design. This is also the flower depicted in the badge associated with the disciples of Sanctus Medicus, and the same flower that seems to bloom on some of the denizens of abundance. Secondly, she seems to be actively analyzing the ambrosial arbor, which is only accessible when aided by the Luofu Vidyadhara. I say this because the tree on the screens in her lab appears to have a root shaped very similarly to the dragon root with the upwards hook. She also has acquired some immortal fruits that she uses in her experiments, further suggesting a connection. Thirdly, she is depicted with some abundance creatures in her trailer, even in a pose that seems very similar to that painting of the creation of Adam, suggesting a god and creation relationship between the subjects. This isn't that surprising though, as Ruan Mei does love to play at God and create all kinds of life. Remember how I mentioned that the story of the Luofu is paralleled with the story of Fontaine with similar themes and shared names? Well, the shared motive of Arthurian Legends is reflected in Ruan Mei, as she literally wears a red philosopher's stone on her chest, suggesting that she is a master of the creation of life and transmutation, which, honestly, she kind of is. The DNA double helix imagery is also something that is found on Novelette's design, creating another interesting connection between her design, Fontaine, and the Imbibitor Lunae. What I'm saying is, the Vidyadhara were unable to find a way to replenish their numbers for thousands of years. It is possible that they just happened to accidentally create Bailu, but doesn't it make more sense if the true mastermind behind her creation was actually the biology genius Ruan Mei, who directly stated her desire to recreate permanence? It's crazy, of course, but it also makes way too much sense. Anyways, what do you think? As always, I'm really keen to hear your thoughts, so please share them and hopefully we can have thoughtful conversations. Special thanks to my friends listed in the video description for their contributions to the lore theories discussed in this video over the past few months. Without them, it would probably be impossible for me to create content at this level of detail. As always, I'm including a list of recommended additional reading for your perusal. Please have a look through those if you got this far. I think my next video is most likely going to be a summary of the Lore in Swarm disaster, followed by a Golden Gears, because it seems like Penacony is a continuation of the story there, and I think it would be the most beneficial content I could create right now. Not many people understand what is happening in the simulated universe lore because of the random chronology, and I think I can help with that because I was making timelines as I read everything to help with comprehension. It's also heavy on the symbolism that's so easy to miss, so yeah. Alright, see you guys next time.